Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, it's pretty simple. We take a monumental figure, we stack up all the sources we can find, and we try to pull out the most essential insights and, the most surprising stories.
And today, the figure is Walker Evans. We're talking 1903 to 1975. An artist whose work really, it didn't just document American history.
No, it almost feels like it wrote the visual history of 20th century America.
That's a great way to put it. I mean, it's hard to overstate his importance. Our sources, and we're talking about major texts from places like the Museum of Modern Art, they position him as one of the most influential artists of the 20th century.
That's a huge claim.
It is. It's a massive institutional endorsement, and it's something we're going to really dig into by looking at his whole career.
Right, because our sources cover everything. We've got his affluent childhood, his early dreams of being a writer.
All the way through to his just incredible work during the Great Depression, his book collaborations, which were, groundbreaking, but also really controversial.
And then his later life as a big-time magazine editor and even a professor at Yale. We really have the full, complex arc.
And we should start with his own mission. Right at the heart of this whole thing is Evans's own goal as a photographer. He said his work had to be literate, authoritative, transcendent.
Okay, that's a fascinating trio of words, literate. When a photographer says he wants his pictures to be literate, what does that even mean? He's not just taking snapshots.
No, not at all. For Evans, literate meant bringing a kind of intellectual rigor to the photo, the kind of structure and precision you'd find in literature. He wanted you to read the images, not just glance at them.
Okay, and authoritative.
That meant they had to feel like undeniable truth, capturing the subject without any manipulation, without any sentimentality, just the facts of the thing.
And transcendent.
That's the art part, elevating the everyday, the common, even the tragic, into something permanent, something that lasts.
And that mission really comes into focus during his most famous period, right? Working for the government, for the Resettlement Administration.
Which then became the Farm Security Administration, or the FSA, yeah. That work, plus his huge collaboration on the book Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, that's what cemented his legacy.
And this is why this deep dive matters so much today, I think. Evans basically created the template for serious documentary photography. But in doing that, he also created a visual language for poverty that we still use.
And that we still critique, absolutely. Understanding how he navigated that tension between art, documentation, politics, and the real lives of the subjects. It's just crucial for understanding our own visual world now.
The ethical questions he raised are still with us every single day. Okay, so let's unpack his journey, and we have to start at the beginning, because Evans's background is, it's so important in understanding the kind of intellectual curiosity he brought to the camera.
It really is. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1903, but he was raised in a very affluent world.
This was not a starving artist story from the get-go.
Not at all. He grew up in wealthy areas in Toledo, Chicago, New York City. His father was an advertising director.
Which is interesting. That would have given him an early look into the power of images, right? Visual persuasion.
Yeah.
Even if he later kind of rejected that whole commercial world.
Exactly. And his education was very privileged. He graduated from Phillips Academy in 1922, then went to Williams College. But it seems like the formal structure of college just wasn't for him.
He dropped out.
After only a year. But it wasn't because he didn't want to learn. The sources are really clear on this. He basically lived in the college library, designing his own curriculum.
What was he studying?
French literature. He was completely obsessed.
So his mind was already steeped in this world of literary modernism, very structured, very observational. And when he got back to New York, he takes this wonderfully humble but also very fitting job.
Yeah, he was a night attendant in the map room of the New York Public Library.
You can just picture it.
Right. Surrounded by all this cartography. Maps are authoritative, they're detailed, they're silent. It's a perfect visual foundation for the kind of photography he was about to get into.
And he didn't stay in New York. That literary passion took him to Paris for a year in 1926.
A defining year. It really cemented his connection to that European high culture, the art scene that was emerging.
So when he comes back, he dives right into this very sophisticated literary and art crowd in New York.
And these weren't nobodies. He's friends with the writer John Cheever, the poet Hart Crane, and maybe most importantly, this hugely influential arts patron, Lincoln Kirstein. He was already part of the intellectual elite way before he was known as a photographer.
But the camera itself doesn't become his main thing until 1928. It's like he spent his whole youth building this intellectual framework.
And then realized that photography was the most powerful, the most modern tool to express it.
There's a very deliberate shift then,
Yeah,
from wanting to be a writer to becoming a visual documentarian.
very. And his influences weren't American portrait painters. They were these European masters who were already creating these huge, systematic visual catalogs of the world.
Who are we talking about here? Who are these masters?
Two main figures. First, Eugene Atget, who had been obsessively documenting Old Paris as it was disappearing. His style was very clear, almost clinical.
And the other?
August Sander. Sander was in the middle of this massive project to catalog all the different classes and professions in German society.
So they were basically trying to create visual encyclopedias.
Exactly. They were making authoritative records. Evans just soaked up that systematic approach, rejecting any kind of sentimentality for this formal clarity that became his trademark.
And it paid off pretty fast.
Very fast. By 1930, just 2 years after he really starts taking pictures, his work is getting published in a huge artistic context. He had 3 photographs of the Brooklyn Bridge in Hart Crane's famous book of poetry, The Bridge.
So he wasn't just illustrating the text. His images were being treated as visual poems themselves, on the same level as this vanguard literature.
It immediately elevated his status, and his early patron, Lincoln Kirstein, saw this unique eye he had. In 1931, Kirstein sponsors this really important early project for him,
What was that?
documenting Victorian houses around Boston. And this really establishes a core theme in all of Evans's work, this fascination with the anonymous, formal structures of American life.
This is where we need to talk about the vernacular.
Yes. We should probably define that for listeners. When we say vernacular architecture, we're talking about everyday, ordinary buildings, things that weren't designed by some famous architect.
So like a standard frame house, a roadside sign, a simple storefront.
Exactly. And Evans was giving these anonymous, commonplace objects the same kind of formal respect that a classical painter might give a king's portrait.
By taking a picture of a simple Victorian house with that kind of clarity, he was making a statement.
He was. He was saying that this ordinary house is just as important, just as revealing about the American character as any grand monument. And that idea becomes the absolute foundation for his most defining work.
So moving on from his origins, there's this real crucible moment that defined his early fieldwork, and it happened in Cuba. Section 2 is all about his pre-depression assignment there in 1933, and this was not a vacation.
No, this was a very serious political job. It was far more than just an artistic trip. He was on assignment for the publisher Lippincott.
And what was the book?
It was for Carlton Beale's book, The Crime of Cuba, which the sources describe as a strident account of the brutal dictatorship of Gerardo Machado.
So Evans wasn't there to shoot beautiful scenery. He was there to collect visual evidence against a dictator.
He was essentially a visual investigative reporter. That context just adds so much weight to the photos he took.
So what did he focus on? What was he looking for in Havana?
He was deliberately looking for the visible signs of a repressed society. So his photos capture the tension of street life, the obvious poverty. You see beggars, dock workers in rags, sad waterfront scenes, and then just the constant oppressive presence of the police and the military.
He didn't capture a riot in progress.
No, the atmosphere of fear and control was right there in the fabric of the city. 31 of his photos ended up in Beale's book, which means this was his first real test in creating that authoritative documentation for a really politically charged story.
And it was the absolute opposite of his dad's advertising career. This was documentation meant to expose something, not sell it.
And it was a trial by fire. It allowed him to really hone his style. That formal composition, incredible detail, and this very non-judgmental presentation of really tough subject matter. He just lets the subject speak for itself.
And this is where we get that fascinating connection between his social mission and his literary world. The Hemingway connection.
Yeah, the sources have this great anecdote. Evans was drinking nightly with Ernest Hemingway, who was already a big deal in Havana.
And Hemingway becomes a kind of temporary patron.
He does. He lends Evans enough money to extend his 2-week trip for another week. The level of trust there is pretty remarkable.
And he was more than just a drinking buddy, right? Evans actually helped him with his work.
He did. He helped Hemingway get his hands on photos from local newspaper archives, photos that documented all the political violence. Hemingway needed that stuff as factual grounding for his novel To Have and Have Not.
So Evans, the literary guy turned photographer, is now feeding visual evidence to one of the biggest writers of the 20th century.
It's an amazing convergence. But the most intriguing detail from this whole Cuba trip comes from the political fear. The Story of the Hidden Prince.
This really highlights how dangerous it was.
Absolutely. Evans knew that his photos, these unposed shots of police and poverty, could easily be seen as critical of the Machado government. He was genuinely afraid the authorities would just confiscate all his negatives and prints before he left the country.
So what did he do to protect his work?
He took this huge precaution. He left a batch of 46 prints with Hemingway for safekeeping.
Wow.
Yeah. He took his negatives back to the U.S., but he hid those 46 prints away in Havana. It was a pretty dramatic move to protect his work.
And those prints were just gone for decades.
For decades, they just vanished into history, locked away, until they were rediscovered in Havana in 2002.
70 years later.
Almost 70 years later, they were eventually exhibited in Key West. It's like finding a lost chapter of his artistic development, one that he intentionally hid to avoid censorship. That experience definitely hardened his view of documentation as a political and often dangerous act.
It totally reframes that Cuba trip. It wasn't just an assignment, it was a critical foundation. He learned how to work under pressure, under the threat of official disapproval, and he would need that experience back in the States very, very soon.
So after that high-stakes work in Cuba, we get to the monumental period. Section 3 is where Walker Evans really defines an era and I think achieves that transcendent quality he was aiming for. The sources all agree that the years 1935 to 1936 were a time of just remarkable productivity and accomplishment.
This is where his visual catalog of America really begins, and is powered by the New Deal. He starts his government work in 1935 with this fixed-term campaign in West Virginia and Pennsylvania.
Right. At first, it's just a limited 2-month job for the Department of the Interior. His task was to photograph a government-built resettlement community.
What was that, exactly?
It was an ambitious project to build new towns, basically, with housing and jobs for unemployed coal miners. The government really needed to show the public that these big programs were actually working, that they were real and concrete.
And that temporary gig turns into his career-defining role. He becomes an information specialist in the Resettlement Administration, the RA.
And the RA pretty quickly becomes the more famous Farm Security Administration, the FSA, which was part of the Department of Agriculture. Evans's mission then shifts to focus almost entirely on the American South, starting in October 1935.
And the FSA's job was to show the scope of rural poverty and distress,
Right.
to justify all this federal aid.
Exactly. He wasn't alone, of course. He was working alongside other giants like Dorothea Lange. But his style, his methods, they really set him apart. And we have to talk about his technical choices here because it directly connects to that authoritative feeling of his work.
Okay, let's get into that.
Well, the critical point is that he was not using a small, fast, handheld camera like a 35 millimeter. For most of his New Deal work, he used a large format, 8 by 10-inch view camera.
So for anyone who doesn't know, what does that mean? An 8 by 10 camera, what's the impact of that choice?
It means everything is slow and deliberate. The camera is huge, it's cumbersome, you need a heavy tripod, you have to compose the image upside down on a ground glass under a dark cloth.
It's the total opposite of being spontaneous.
The total opposite. The subject knows they're being photographed. The photographer has to be completely deliberate. It forces stillness and formality. But the negative you get is massive, 8 inches by 10 inches. It captures an unbelievable amount of detail and resolution.
So that slow, mechanical process is reinforcing his artistic goal. It makes the images feel authoritative because the process itself demands that level of deliberation.
Precisely. The final image is this indisputable high-resolution record. The subject is presented with this kind of dignity that comes from the formal composition, even if they're standing in rags.
We have some iconic examples from this time that show this perfectly. Let's start with Bethlehem Graveyard and Steel Mill from November 1935 in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, this image is just a masterclass in composition and social commentary. Evans places St. Michael's Cemetery right in the foreground. You see the gravestones, the markers of history, mortality, the people who came before.
And right behind it.
Looming over it are the huge industrial smokestacks of Bethlehem steel.
So it's not just a pretty picture, it's a very controlled statement about the American landscape.
Absolutely. Industry, the source of jobs, but also pollution and a kind of brutal progress, is literally standing on top of the resting place of the workers who built it. It's a metaphor for these conflicting priorities: prosperity and exploitation, history and the future. It's all in one perfectly balanced frame. This is that literate quality in action.
And his focus wasn't just on industry or faces. He kept going with that theme. He started with Lincoln Kirstein, documenting the vernacular. Let's talk about his March 1936 photo, Frame House, Charleston, South Carolina.
That's a great example of his bigger project, which was cataloging America. Why photograph a simple, maybe even rundown frame house?
Because he believed that this anonymous, everyday architecture, the small church, the gas station, the roadside sign, tells you more about the soul of a place than a big government building.
He was elevating the commonplace to the level of high art. He was building this visual inventory, treating these structures with this incredible formal seriousness. He was saying, look at this house. It's important. It's permanent. It is part of the American visual record. And his success with the FSA, where he made thousands of these records, set the stage for his most famous and most controversial work.
All right, section 4. This is where the artistic triumph and the most difficult ethical questions of Evans' career just collide head-on. The story of Let Us Now Trace Famous Men.
This is the ethical crucible of his career, no question. It all centered on his collaboration with the writer James Agee. The project starts in the summer of 1936. Evans takes a leave of absence from the FSA, and he and Agee are sent by Fortune magazine down to Hale County, Alabama.
And their assignment was to report on the lives of white tenant farmers, a story that would require this just unprecedented level of intimacy and access.
And here's the great irony. Fortune commissions this incredibly intensive piece of journalism, and then they refuse to publish it.
Why?
The material was just too raw. It was too personal, too intense, too critical of the whole system. It was just considered too unorthodox for their readers at the time.
But that material, thank goodness, was preserved. The photos and Agee's texts were finally published as the book Let Us Now Praise Famous Men in 1941. And it documented their stay with 3 specific families.
Right. The families headed by Bud Fields, Floyd Burroughs, and Frank Tingle. And specifically, the images of Allie Mae Burroughs, who was Floyd's wife, became instantly iconic. Those portraits are now the quintessential visual shorthand for Depression-era hardship and quiet dignity.
But the collaboration itself created this powerful contradiction, this what the critic Janet Malcolm called an anguished dissonance. The text and the photos almost seemed to be fighting with each other.
They absolutely are. Agee's writing is this desperate, almost overwrought cry of pain. It's so emotional, so judgmental about the injustices that trap these families. And it's written with this intense sense of personal guilt over his own role as an observer.
But Evans's photos?
Evans's photos are the exact opposite. They're silent. They're so formally composed, symmetrical. They have this, as Malcolm called it, quiet, magisterial beauty. They are facts, not sermons.
He was deliberately refusing to get caught up in Agee's emotional storm.
Completely. His pictures presented the interiors of their cabins, the faces of the kids, the clothes they wore, as these formal, almost classical subjects. The message feels like Agee's telling you how awful they feel, but I'm showing you the enduring architectural facts of their existence. And in that, they possess dignity.
And that artistic difference is what leads to the core ethical problems, something the families had to deal with for the rest of their lives.
For sure. The sources detailed the controversy and the resentment felt by the descendants decades later. I mean, there was immediate fear. The landowners told the families that Evans and Agee were Soviet agents.
Seriously?
Yeah, trying to scare them into not cooperating. Allie Mae Burroughs later said she didn't believe that, but the deeper sense of being exploited, that stayed.
The burden of being the subject of iconic art about poverty it's just profound.
It is. The sources talk about the pain that was still there when Fortune magazine went back to Hale County in 2005 for their 75th anniversary. They talked to Charles Burroughs, who was Floyd and Allie Mae's son. He was only 4 when Evans and Agee were there.
And even after all that time,
Over 60 years later, Charles Burroughs was, and I'm quoting, still angry at them. That is a deep, persistent wound.
what was he angry about specifically?
A couple of things. One, that they never even sent the family a copy of the book. He felt like they were just used and then discarded. But more than that, he was angry that his family was, in his words, cast in a light that they couldn't do any better, that they were doomed, ignorant.
Doomed. Ignorant. Wow. That's just a heartbreaking summary of how the subject can feel betrayed. Evans's goal was transcendence, but for the family, the result was feeling like their own agency was stripped away, and they were just fixed forever as these symbols of misery.
It forces us to ask that question. When documentation serves a big artistic or political agenda, even a noble one, can the artist ever be truly non-judgmental without causing harm to the person who becomes the symbol? The whole complex legacy of that book is that its artistic triumph came at a real, lasting human cost.
So Evans stays with the FSA until 1938. But his career just explodes beyond government work after that. And 1938, according to the sources, was this year of just incredible milestones for him.
It was a huge year. In 1938, the Museum of Modern Art MoMA gives him a solo exhibition called Walker Evans, American Photographs. This was, groundbreaking. It was the first exhibition in the museum's entire history that was devoted to the work of a single photographer.
That's the highest form of validation you can get. It officially puts documentary photography on the same level as painting or sculpture. He's not just a government photographer anymore, he's a major artist.
Exactly. And the catalog for that show had an essay by his old friend and patron, Lincoln Kirstein. So this is his canonization. But at the exact same time, he's starting one of his most radical and covert experiments.
This is the Hidden Camera Project in the New York City subway.
Yes, also starting in 1938. For this, he used a camera hidden inside his coat, which let him photograph people on the subway completely unposed and totally unaware. It's such a contrast to the formal 8x10 work.
The FSA work captured the public face of America, the storefront, the house, the posed portrait. The subway series feels like it's capturing the private, internal world of the city dweller.
It's a totally different kind of document. It's about spontaneity, intimacy, the unintentional theater of city life. He's capturing isolation, exhaustion, private thoughts in this really dense public space. The photos were later collected in the book Many Are Called.
And his influence wasn't just in his own work. He was passing it on to the next generation.
Oh, absolutely. From 1938 to 1939, he's working with and mentoring Helen Levitt, who goes on to become a giant of New York street photography in her own right. His circle was really the nucleus of modern documentary art.
There's a fascinating detail about his process, though, specifically about printing. For someone so obsessed with the final image, he was surprisingly hands-off in the darkroom.
This tells you so much about what he valued. The sources say that, kind of like Henri Cartier-Bresson, Evans almost never spent time physically making prints from his own negatives.
That's who did it.
He'd delegate it. He would loosely supervise the process, but sometimes he would just attach these handwritten notes to the negatives with instructions on how the final print should look.
So his genius was in the capture, the vision,
Yeah.
not the chemical process.
Exactly. The authority of the image was locked in the moment the shutter clicked, thanks to his composition in that incredible large format camera. The physical print was just a technical task that needed to be managed as long as it met his standards.
And then his career takes this huge shift away from being in the field and into these positions of institutional power. He was becoming a real tastemaker.
Right. First, he keeps getting validation for his own work. He gets 3 Guggenheim Fellowships between 1940 and 1959, which lets him keep documenting America long after the FSA was gone.
Then he moves into these big editorial jobs. He becomes a staff writer at Time magazine in 1945.
And then, shortly after, an editor at Fortune from 1945 all the way to 1965. And think about the irony there.
The same magazine that rejected his work.
The very same magazine that found his groundbreaking story on the Alabama tenant farmers too radical in 1936. He's now one of their editors and gatekeepers for 2 decades.
So he goes from being the subject matter expert to the institutional authority, shaping what gets published in elite American media.
And his final professional chapter is in academia, another key step in the institutionalization of photography. In 1965, he becomes a professor of photography on the graphic design faculty at the Yale University School of Art.
That whole progression, from field photographer to magazine editor to university professor, it mirrors the growing acceptance of photography as a serious art form. And he was central to making that happen.
And his final projects, they reflect both his old style and, well, his age. In 1968, he does this formal black and white portfolio for the investment bank Brown Brothers Harriman. The same authoritative style he used on sharecroppers, he's now using on corporate power.
And then his very last work, in 73 and 74, uses this brand new technology, the Polaroid SX70 instant camera.
Yeah, the sources say Polaroid knew who he was and just gave him an unlimited supply of film. After decades with that slow, heavy 8x10 camera, the instant simplicity of the Polaroid was just much easier for him as an older man. It shows he never lost that desire to capture the world right up to the very end.
Okay, so Section 6 brings us to his legacy, the definitive recognition he received, and this really crucial legal detail that shapes how we all see his images today. If we're trying to nail down his aesthetic, Evans actually gave it a name himself.
He did. During a lecture at Yale in 1964, he called his own work lyric documentary.
Which is perfect.
It really is. It's the perfect summary of that tension we've been talking about. Documentary because it's based in fact, in truth. But lyric because of the composition, the beauty, the formal poetry of it all.
And other critics kept coming back to his focus on common things. Jane Tormey described his later work as having a vernacular style, just hammering home that core idea he pursued his whole life, elevating the everyday.
And the art world gave him that final definitive stamp of approval while he was still alive. After that first MoMA show in '38, the first really definitive retrospective of his work came in 1971, curated by the legendary John Zerkowski. It was just called Walker Evans. The sheer scope of it confirmed his status as an essential American artist.
And that recognition has just kept going. In 2000, the Met held another huge retrospective. He was inducted into the St. Louis Walk of Fame.
And you can see his influence in just the sheer volume of his work held in museums all over the world. The Art Institute of Chicago, the Getty, has over 1,300 of his works. His vision is preserved and accessible.
He died in New Haven, Connecticut in 1975 at 71 after a stroke. But even the story of his final conversation is all about his life's work.
His focus was just unwavering. Hank O'Neill, who was putting together this project about the FSA photographers called A Vision Shared, said that Evans called him to talk about finding one specific picture for the project.
And that conversation about finding the exact right visual document happened just an hour and a half before he died.
It's incredible. It just underscores that his whole life was this constant, diligent assembly of the American visual inventory right up to his very last moments.
Okay, so now we get to this crucial legal detail about his legacy, the copyright distinction. This is the ultimate irony, and it's so important for how we see his work today.
It is. There's a huge split in who owns his work, and it affects everyone, including you listening right now.
Let's break it down.
Okay, so in 1994, Evans' estate transferred most of its holdings, the Subway series, the Cuba photos, all the later independent work, to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Met is the sole copyright holder for the vast majority of his images.
So if you want to use those photos, you have to go through the Met.
Yeah.
But there's this massive, crucial exception.
The one that changes everything. The group of about 1,000 negatives that he created specifically for the Resettlement Administration and the Farm Security Administration, those are in the collection of the Library of Congress.
And because he made those images while he was a U.S. government employee as part of a public work program.
They are in the public domain.
So the most famous, most historically important, most reproduced images, the portrait of Allie Mae Burroughs, the Alabama interiors, the iconic frame houses of the Depression are completely free for anyone to use, study, and republish.
It's this accidental but really profound outcome. The images that were commissioned to justify some temporary government aid became this permanent, free gift to the visual history of the entire country. His desire for transcendence found its ultimate expression in public access.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've traced a career that really synthesized this literary rigor with a kind of photographic formality. He goes from this affluent intellectual background to creating the defining, non-judgmental visual record of American hardship.
He absolutely achieved his goal of making pictures that were authoritative and transcendent. But the enduring tension for me is still the ethical complexity of let us now praise famous men. His documentation, as important as it is to history, had a real lasting impact on the lives of the people he photographed.
That feeling of exposure, of being fixed in time as doomed ignorant, as Charles Burroughs put it, it just reminds you that the power of the documentarian is immense, and it comes with this lasting responsibility.
It forces us to constantly think about that relationship between the artist and the subject, especially in times of crisis. When the images become transcendent art, what moral debt is owed to the person in the frame? That's the tension that will always define the genre he helped perfect.
And that leads us right back to that final, fascinating twist of his legacy. Evans wanted his work to be permanent and transcendent. We talked about how his FSA work, the stuff he did on the government's payroll, is now in the public domain.
Which ensures that those images of the Great Depression, the faces, the homes, the landscapes, can be endlessly reproduced, reinterpreted, and reused. It guarantees their immortality in a way that goes far beyond what the New Deal agencies ever intended.
Yeah, it's an enduring, free, and public record of a pivotal moment in history. But here's the provocative thought we want to leave you with. Does the universal public domain availability of those FSA photos, which guarantees they'll be seen by billions, offer a strange kind of retroactive justice to the subjects, like the Burroughs family, who felt so exploited by the art?
Or does that public access simply perpetuate the symbolic representation of their suffering forever, denying them ownership of their own story for all time? The visual history of America remains a truly permanent but perpetually complicated vision.